Good morning, everyone. My name is George Ganal. I've been with Interactive Intelligence and Genesis for 20 years. So started doing handler stuff back with version 1.2F of the Interaction Center. Maybe remembers that back that far. So hopefully I'll be able to communicate to you enough this morning that you'll be able to get rolling and started on customization. How many of you have actually gotten in and customized handlers before in the Interaction Center? So who wants to come up and teach? I'd like to sit and watch for a minute. Maybe? No? All right. Feel free to interrupt anytime as well, ask questions. If it's too complicated for this session, I'll just say, hey, we'll talk after. But it's always good to have some interplay back and forth, especially if you want clarification on something. That's me. Email's up there, or if you can't remember that, just email askgeorge@genesis.com and we'll get to you. So for the agenda today, we're going to do a little bit of an Interaction Designer overview, not a lot because I know a lot of you have already gotten into the interface. Just point out a few things. Talk about customizing handlers in general. We'll talk a bit about custom ACD, both calls and emails. Talk about the REST tools a bit, system tools, accumulators. In case nobody's used accumulators or something to know about. Telephony tools, client buttons, putting it all together with a couple of scenarios. So first, just talking about Interaction Designer. Here's your Interaction Designer interface. Main things to know about Interaction Designer. You start off, of course, running it. It comes up with a blank file, blank slate to work with. When you want to build handlers, you have to add in an initiator for the handler through the change initiator. And depending on what type of handler you're going to be creating, you need to know the right initiator to use. Remember that if you already have a handler that's a primary handler that's using that initiator, you cannot create a second primary handler that uses the same initiator and have it actually work. You only have one handler using the same initiator that's a primary handler at a time. And you'll notice that it'll publish fine, it'll look like it's running fine, but when you actually go to test it, you'll see that the new handler won't actually run when you're trying to test it. Then you go look in the event viewer and you'll notice, oh, there's some little warnings in there that the publish actually failed because there's already some other handler with that initiator. The main one you'll be using is probably the subroutine initiator, because that allows you to create a subroutine that can then be called from another handler. There are a few others you might use. Some you might use in a monitor mode. So you can actually have monitor handlers, as many as you want using the same initiator. They all run in the background at a lower priority than the primary handlers. And you might do something like monitoring a status, monitoring a call disconnect, a call transfer, call something. There are various things you might monitor with one of those call monitor, agent monitor, whatever, initiators. And multiple ones of those can run in the background. And then a few others, like the client button. As long as the initiator is unique as far as the settings, you can use multiples of the same initiator, but it has to be unique. Menus, just things to be aware of on the file menu. There's a download handler from server. You can go find a handler stored, and you may know where the handlers are actually stored on the server. And that's the other thing to remember. When you publish handlers from this designer interface, publishing a handler makes it active, ready for use on the system. Just a quick note on when you're opening, closing, saving, whatever handlers. You have this i3ic handlers folder, and there's the 4.0 handlers folder below that. Here's where all the main system handlers are stored that come with the system. It's normally a read-only folder. Set to read-only because you don't want to overwrite those handlers by mistake. This is where the main working copy is, the .ihd file. So that's the one you work with in the Interaction Designer interface. When you're going to modify something, store them in some structure underneath custom, so you know which ones have been customized. Still the ihd files. These are not the files that actually run on the server when you're pulling up, or when you're actually using the system. As mentioned, there's the server folder. Then under the server folder, there's a handlers folder. And here you're going to find the actual version that's running on the server. So if you're never excuse me, if you're ever not sure which version of an IHD file is actually the one you want to modify, because that's the one that's running on the server, you can download from server, and it'll go to this folder. You can pull up the one from the server. You can also do that through the Dependency Viewer. You can go to a handler in there and download it so you know you've got the one that's actually running on the server. Or you can come into this server handlers folder and you'll see the IHD files. And then you'll see this .class file. Anybody remember what .class means? What type of file is that? Java file. Exactly, we lie. Handlers all used to be done in Java. We quit that many, many years ago. So the .class files are actually just I3 speak language. You can open them up in Notepad or whatever, WordPad, let's say, and you can read them. They're just plain text, but you cannot modify the functionality from these files. You can look at it, can't modify and have it work because they're hashed, and if you modify it, then it breaks everything. So don't modify them, but you can look at them. But those are the actual files that get loaded up into memory and run on the server, the .class files. So when you publish, it compiles everything, strips out all the graphics, creates a .class file, and that's what runs. There's an export to XML if you really want to export all the files to XML, and then you can store them off on the side. You can search through them, parse through, find what variables are being used where, all that kind of great stuff. If you just want to have a different way of going through and analyzing the handlers. The change initiators there, debug the handler you're in. Under preferences, just note that you do have a few preferences you can set. So when you're starting a debug session, where do you want it to start the debug? At the initiator, at the notify debugger step, first one, or just prompt you every time? By default, the prompts. When you stop the debug session, do you want it to just automatically stop the handler execution or continue until it ends? Or do you want it to prompt you? Do you want to end the handler? Do you want to let it continue to run? And then watch variable stuff. Handler downloads. General settings, do you want to prompt when a handler contains warnings? You're about to publish it, pops up, hey, you got warnings. Do you care? Maybe not. Starting directory, you can set that. Expression editor. Then also the DB query step. Here's one of the main ones you want to know about. When you have a DB query, what is the default, or what is the timeout when it's trying to retrieve records from the data source? So it's set to 15 seconds by default. If you don't know that, you're doing a query on an IVR, and the customer is just sitting there for 15 seconds of dead air, waiting for the response to come back. You can change that here if you don't want them to wait 15 seconds, or if you want to wait 30, you want to wait 5, whatever it might be. You can change the timeout here. And zoom. Good stuff. The utilities menu, just want to point out a couple of things. Remember when you manage handlers, I talked about primary handlers versus monitor handlers. Remember that anything on this primary handlers tab, right-hand side, they're active. You can only have one handler per initiator or unique initiator running in this primary handlers on the active side. Then monitor handlers, you can have as many as you want sharing the same initiator because they run at a lower priority. They don't interfere with each other. And just realize too, if you have subroutines that are inactive, there's not going to be any error thrown when you're running a handler that calls a subroutine that's inactive. It's just going to skip over it. You're not going to see warnings or errors necessarily in the logs. It's just not going to run it because you told it not to. So if you're not seeing the functionality you thought should be there with the subroutine you created, go in and make sure that it's actually active, not on the inactive side. Another thing on the utilities menu, we'll talk about stored procedures in our session later today. The dependency viewer, little backstory. People often ask, do you have any handler maps or anything that shows the flow through the system? You know, it starts off in system underscore incoming call, and then it goes to this, and then it goes to whatever other handlers down the line. What's the flow? Where do I find that? And do you have any help that talks about what the handlers do? Answer is, we used to have handler maps, but once the dependency viewer came out, the developer said, oh, we don't need to create handler maps anymore because they can just use the dependency viewer and create their own. So you're on your own to create the flows of what handler calls what handler and so on down the line. That's a little bit misleading because in here you can see when a handler calls a subroutine, but you cannot see when a handler uses a tool step that sends an event notification that then starts another handler based upon an event notification. So you can't fully map the flow of handlers just using Dependency Viewer. You'll have to actually put them in debug, watch it, see the flow, and create your own mapping. That's an unfortunate thing that went away many years ago as far as the handler maps. There's also a soap wizard. Won't get into that here. But power tools, these can be useful. There's the auto label assignments, auto label conditions. I usually turn that on because I want the label on the tool step to actually show me the statement that's within that step. So I can see at a glance, what is the condition statement that's there? What is the assignment statement that's in that step? Then also there's a handler diff utility, which can be very useful. If you have that pristine directory for handlers, or you save all the system handlers aside someplace, or your own handlers that you create, you have a known clean copy. And there are multiple developers working on the system, let's say, or maybe somebody left and now you're taking over. You can take a directory of handlers that are known good from the system, let's say, saved aside, and then another set of handlers, you can do a diff between them and find out what is the difference between these two sets of handlers. It'll actually pull up and show you, okay, this step is no longer connected with the same as the original. It's connected somewhere else, so this variable has changed, or these steps have been added or removed, whatever. So a handler diff is very useful when you're trying to figure out what somebody else did to a handler, as long as you have a known good version of the handler, or original version of the handler. That's the main stuff there. And then import prompts, export prompts. That's if you're doing your own localization of prompts and prompt strings. You can import and export here, modify, bring it back in. An example of that way back, I had a student who worked with Big Ideas Productions. If everybody's heard of VeggieTales videos. They were in class. He wanted to actually have all of his prompts in VeggieTales voices. Okay, we don't have a language for that. But if you wanted to, you can export all your prompts to strings, put in all the prompts in Veggie voices, and bring it back in, and it'll have all the prompts mapped to the right voices, and you just have a new language called Veggie on your system. And that worked out great. Down here, the palettes, you have the tools palette. So all the different tools, they're called tools are on the palette. They're called tool steps or steps when we're actually in the handler, just for parlance. There's also the subroutines palette because you're an artist and you're creating works of art here. Don't forget that. The subroutines palette has all the subroutines that have been created, saved, and published on the system. That doesn't mean they're actually active. It just means that they're published. So if I have a subroutine here and I drag it into a handler and I think it's going to work because it's on the palette, not necessarily. You need to make sure it's also active. And usually you'll add your own customizations into the custom tab. If you want to add something into a different tab, let's say I've got a REST handler here and I want to put it onto a REST tab. I can publish it, make it active. That's not the right one. That's custom notification. Let me go find another one that's actually not a custom notification. I'll pretend this is one that I was using someplace else. Publish it. If I want to create a new tab, I can just type it in. Click OK, and that puts it on a new tab named Secure. You cannot drag and drop subroutines between palettes. If you want to move a subroutine from one tab to another, you have to republish it. In order to get rid of the tab, you have to republish all those subroutines that are on that tab so that they're put on the other tabs, and then it goes away automatically. Just one of the quirks. In case that ever drove you nuts like it did me for a while. Then also other available windows and tab palettes are available. You have the messages window, so if something is wrong in a handler, So I delete the second step. Pops in an error message saying something is wrong, and it will just allow me to double click on the message. It goes right to the step that has a problem. So that's a fairly useful thing. If it has a red face, there's an error you cannot publish. If it has a yellow face, it's a warning, you can still publish. If it has a gray face, it means that you might have subroutine that's not. Actually, gray face means you cannot publish, you don't have the rights to do so. And then green face means it's fine, it's good for publishing. So that messages palette is a good thing to know about. You also have the variables palette off to the side. If you double click on a particular variable, it opens up the quick jump palette and lets you see the steps that use that particular variable, so you can quickly jump to a variable, find it right away. So that's a quick jump palette. When you're in debug mode, there's a debug palette that comes up. You can watch the variables, either on the steps, the handlers, put in watch variables. A lot of useful stuff there. You can explore that on your own. Just a quick tour through the interface. Any questions there real quick? Fairly common sense. Okay, so customizing handlers. There are several ways to customize the system. So when you're working with handlers, one of the main ways is to modify functionality through customization points. Has anybody here ever modified non-customization points and called support and tried to get support on it? They don't tend to like that very much. In fact, we officially don't support you changing the system handlers that ship with the system because we have customization points. A lot of times when a customer or partner is trying to work on a handler and there's no customization point available where they need it, then they actually usually create a customization point specifically for that situation, and then it's going to be in all of the releases after that, if it's warranted. So use customization points. They begin with the word custom. There's no functionality in them out of the box. We don't change anything, so if you have customizations added and then we update the system, publish all new handlers, we're not going to overwrite the customization points. It's fair game to overwrite all of the other handlers. So if you're going to modify system level handlers, make sure you have good backup copies so that when you upgrade and all the new handlers get published, you don't lose all your functionality. You'll be able to see what the new handlers do, merge in your old changes because you don't want to lose the new stuff we put in there, and it's quite a pain. So always use customization points is the best move. When you are doing customizations through these customization points, you're going to use that subroutine initiator to create your own subroutines. So compartmentalized pockets of code that you're going to use for your own customizations. And a lot of times, and this is best practices recommendation, do as much as you can in interaction attendant as far as customizing workgroup, queue flow, anything else you can do in attendant. You can actually do SOAP calls out to web services. You can do a lot of selection stuff in attendant. There are many different things you can do in attendant that really takes about 90% off of the load, usually off of the handler side. But some people prefer to do all on the handlers. Some people can't stand attendant, whatever it might be. It's just recommended you do as much as you can with attendant. Okay, getting into some of the actual handler stuff, custom ACD processing. Starting off with calls. In here. When you're working with customizing ACD for calls, you can modify some things there are some customization points in the handlers that are called from interaction attendant, so you can actually do some custom work in there. Most of it, though, is going to be done through, if you have a custom work group, so you choose work group has queue, and then you choose custom for the type of work group as opposed to ACD, then you need to modify this custom IVR workgroup queue handler to have functionality for that specific workgroup queue. Normally you're going to have a selection step in here, one for each queue. So it comes in, you're going to select the queue that you're going to be working with. So basic tools, selection. Normally you're going to have that. Show you nice and palette, of course it doesn't work there. So queue name, P_S queue name is what you're keying on. And usually I use a string lower just to make sure that I don't have a mismatch between the name that's in Interaction Administrator and the name that shows up here that I'm using here. So let's say I had a worker named customer service. And that one could branch off to here. The default could just be left alone. And then it would feed into the functionality for that customer service queue, and then I'd have a different step in the selection for each workgroup that I want to work with. That's one of the main things with the custom ACD handling. Another main thing you need to remember at the very end, there's this assignment of a variable named P_B transferred. Coming out of the subroutine, when it goes back to the handler that calls it, there's a check, a condition step that says, what is P_B transferred set to? Is it true? If it is true, then I'm going to end the handler that called this one. Because I don't want to continue processing up above since this handler has already transferred it into ACD processing and it's already working on it someplace else. If I've not transferred it to another workgroup queue already in here, then it remains as false, and then the other handler continues on and processes it on down the line. You just don't want two handlers trying to compete with the same call or control. So always make sure you set your P_B transferred to true in this subroutine. So for customizations with ACD, normally it's going to involve something like skills, changing the weights for the skills. So you can set up skills in interaction attendant. That's easy. You can put skills on the interactions. But what this allows you to do with the ACD specify interaction skill, on the input side, you can put in things like the minimum proficiency level and the maximum proficiency level. So if I have agents in a queue and I want to do, quote, bullseye routing, something like that, I want specific agents to get the call, even though there are 50 agents that have the skill, maybe only 10 of them have a proficiency level in the range of 50 to 100. So I want to narrow it down and say, for this call, I want people who are at least 50 for their proficiency to get the call. So I can change it here. And now, only people with that minimum proficiency can receive the call in that workgroup. I could also set a weight for the proficiency level. So here's where you can really fine-tune your ACD calculation. Because ACD, when it's looking for somebody to transfer the call to, it just builds a score for each agent. It looks at their proficiencies and skills and desire to use, if we have that enabled, and all the different stuff that goes into the calculation. There's a formula you can see in the help. And then it calculates it based upon the settings here. So maybe to me, the proficiency for this skill is double what it is for other skills. So I put a 2 in there for the weight for proficiency level. So it's actually going to put a multiplier in the calculation and say, take that user's proficiency level, multiply it by 2 as part of the overall calculation. You also have a desire to use level. Notice here, desire to use is 0 by default. I don't know if you can see that even. Get this bigger for you. Probably not. But the weight for desire to use is 0 by default. So we don't even use that setting on the users. If you want to enable it, you have to do custom ACD, and you have to enable it in the ACD specify skill, or also the ACD initiate processing tool step. So it just disregards desire to use, doesn't factor it in at all unless you enable it. Something to be aware of. And I can do multiple skills, so I've got 2 different skills. This one has a weight of 1, don't care for minimum proficiency. Then in the ACD initiate processing, there are a bunch of different things we can manipulate here as far as the overall calculation for the scoring. The first tab is for agent scoring, so I'm going to manipulate how we calculate the agent score. The second tab is interaction scoring. So we have multiple interactions sitting in queue. One agent becomes available. How do we pick the right agent? Or excuse me, how do we pick the right interaction? We base it on the scoring set up here. And you put in a weight for priority. So if you want higher priority calls to have much more weight and have the priority override time available, other things for the agent, set the weight for priority a lot higher. You can actually put negative weights in here as well. So for example, on the agent cost, one of the things we'll often do is put a negative weight on the agent cost. So a higher cost agent will be less likely to be chosen for an interaction. Because we pay on commission, we want to save money, we're cheap, or whatever. So you can set a negative value on cost, and then in Interaction Administrator, you just put in 0 to 100, whatever the agent cost is relative to other agents, and subtract it out of the equation if you want lower cost agents picked first. So there are a lot of little tips and tricks in here. Wait for agent available time. Is that something that's more important or less important to you? How long has the agent been sitting there available? If I've got somebody, if I want to really emphasize agent available time, I'll set that weight much higher on the agent available time. And you notice here agent attributes 1, 2, and 3. Those are in Interaction Administrator. Most people don't use them, but you can. If I go into a user configuration, ACD tab, got options 1, 2, and 3 for the attributes. So you can just put a value in there, 1 to 100, and factor those into the calculation as well. They're not named, you just arbitrarily say, well, attribute 1, I have a value in there, and I'm going to compare between agents because I want one more value to look at. That's something, once again, you only activate in custom ACD through this handler. If that makes sense. And then once you get all that stuff set up, the ACD initiate processing actually sends a notification that starts another handler that dumps it into the queue, picks an agent, or picks an interaction to send to an agent, and goes on from there. There are a few other things on the ACD tab on the tools. I won't get deep into them, but agent categories. You can use agent categories to actually narrow down which agents are allowed to answer specific interactions. So you might have VIP customers. You can assign a category with that customer's name to the interaction, and then only agents who are in that category can answer that interaction. So I can assign categories to agents, and then I can assign categories to the calls, and then use that for routing to narrow down the pool of people who are in the work group who can answer a call for a particular customer. The assigning is done through this ACD agent category tool set. There is some stuff in the help. You can actually do an automated assigning of a category to all agents based upon the agent name. That's something you just look up later when you have a chance. That's where you're in a call center where they actually want to route each interaction by a specific agent name. It's something that's just built in. Most times you're going to be assigning a category based upon the customer's name coming in, for example. And I don't know if I have. I might have a handle on that. Yeah. So setting categories, for example, I do a table lookup. I can look in a table that's built in Interaction Designer, find out what categories go with which agents, and then I just loop around and I set all the categories on those agents, or remove the categories depending on the time of day, basically. So the only way to set the categories is through handlers. You can't actually view what categories are assigned to agents except in the logs. There's no just easy view, oh, I've got these agents in these categories. So you just kind of have to set them and then maybe loop back on a timer and keep setting them to make sure that they're set for the time period that you want them to be set. But it's something you can do. The interaction details can be useful when you're trying to make decisions on what to do with an interaction that's sitting in queue waiting for an agent, for example. It has all the statistics about the interaction, what's its priority, time in ACD queue, time until ACD timeout, different things in here, waits for the interaction. It's a lot of information about the interaction itself that you can then use to make some decisions while it's waiting in queue. Let's say you want to allow it to go up to a certain level, and then you want to present a menu before it actually times out in the queue. There is this ACD remove interaction skill, which is one that can be a bit hazardous. It just removes a skill from the interaction, and there's some debate out there as to what it actually does. In my experience, if I use it in a side handler, I can pull skills off of an interaction, and it does not actually push it back in the queue, does not make it leave the queue and come back into the queue for it to take effect. Or others who would say, no, you have to pull it out of the queue and put it back in for that to actually take effect. That's not based on my experimentation, but sometimes I have to just trust what PS says. But you can remove skills from the interaction while it's waiting in queue so that you have a better chance of it going to an agent who can actually answer it. Specify interaction categories, so you can say which category is assigned to a specific interaction. Once again, you look up based upon the customer name, handy, whatever, and assign that. I better stop talking because we're going to run out of time. That's just some basics on the ACD. The other thing I want to point out real quick is email. And when you're doing email ACD, if you're not using interaction attendant to do some customization, you can actually open up the email messages in the handler. So, for example, you can get the cookie for a message using this email interaction get message tool step. So you have to first use the interaction ID to get the cookie, and then you open the message by cookie. So that opens that message to work with it, and the outputs are all the body, the sender, the subject, the importance, all that stuff is in there. So now, once I've got that information, I can parse through. First thing I have to do is get a body out of the list of email bodies, because we have multiple bodies possible on there. Then you want to parse the email body and put it into a text or a string-based variable. So it's not easy, it's kind of complicated. So you got to get the body from the list of bodies, and you parse it out into a string variable, and then you can look through that string and say, okay, is one of these values in that string? So if it's in the body or it's in the subject or whatever, I want to route to a certain queue based upon a word that's in the body or a word that's in the subject or something like that. And from there, branch out, specify the skill that's required, let's say, and then dump it into queue. So that's just an example real quick to do something with emails in handlers, or you can just set everything up in interaction attendant, use that email queuing, and it'll do all the same stuff. It's easier there, but if you want to go custom, you can. Any questions on the ACD handlers? I don't want to move on before it goes too long.
When you start the ACD initiate processing, it leaves the handler, so how do you control what happens during the...
Yeah, that ACD initiate processing, fortunately it's in the help, but it actually sends an event notification. So it generates an ACD process queue item event, and that starts this ACD available interaction handler. So if this handler dies, but another handler starts based upon that event notification. So you can still, if you have that one in debug mode, when it gets to this ACD process interaction step, you'll see that other one start. Yeah, so that's an important thing. Always, when you get to a step at the end of a handler, and you don't know where it's going after that, well, here's an ACD initiate processing, and then there's really nothing after that. What does it do? Pull up the help. It should be documented what event it runs and tells you where it goes.
Yeah, I had this question from a customer because they wanted to, with emails, you can't do like schedules on them in the attendant. Is that possible through the handler to not deliver emails at certain times? If you have
Well, in attendant, you can have schedules in there which are open and closed on the queue, but that really determines when the emails get dumped into queue.
Yeah.
So they'll sit in the email server, and then when the schedule turns on, it opens up, and they all dump into the queue, and then they're in the queue, so they're going to distribute.
Right.
So you can't say, okay, once they're in the queue, we can't deliver them anymore.
Okay.
You could put, if you wanted to go fully custom, you could put something in here, because there is a get schedules, and you could use all the scheduling tools to figure out, okay, is it within the range where I want to deliver emails or not? And if not, then you just don't go on to that process and just leave it in queue.
Yeah, I haven't tried with the email attendant, but does that allow subroutine calls as well? Subroutine.
Yeah, I think it does. My memory is it does. You can go to the desktop real quick. Email attendant. Just happen to have it handy. Yes, it does have the subroutine call.
Okay. Great.
All right, so that's ACD. Calls and emails. Talk about REST tools a little bit. Does anybody here have a need to talk to a web service from handlers using REST-based web service? Okay, because those are some new tools they added in. They used to have those, and it's been handy. I've actually used it a lot, talking between Interaction Center and PureConnect, doing API calls there.
There are some weird quirks with SOAP. We had lots of issues with that,
Yeah.
especially with certificates.
Yeah.
Because that's not documented at all. I had to have some special
Reminder.
Yeah.
Documented.
Documented.
Way back, Don Brown, the owner of Interactive Intelligence, was talking to our documentation manager and telling him, actually I used to be the documentation manager, but the one who followed me, or the one who preceded and then followed me. Anyway, talking to him saying, hey, only 10% of the people actually read the documentation anyhow, so you might as well just put up a wiki and let them modify it themselves. That went over well. It's like, yeah, that'd be good. Just wiki documentation, people can put in whatever they want. Makes sense. So one REST sample here. First thing with REST tools, you need to get a token to use. And I should figure out how to make the screen bigger. But basically, with a bearer token request, you have to decide what type of authentication you're using. I usually use the client credentials version of authentication, where it's got a client ID or key and then a secret. And yeah, there are plain text in here in the handler. Most people are not going to be getting into the handler. But this is the ID key that comes from my web service, and it's the secret that comes from my web service. I've got the URL that I need to send it to for getting the token, the authorization token. We do have the ability to put in a username and password if you're going to go with that type of authorization or authentication instead. You have basically, it says in here what it will use. Yeah, grant types, you have client credentials or password are the two main ones that you have, but it defaults to client credentials. So not all the authorization types are available, but you can use username and password or client credentials. Then you have content type, which is normally going to be this application/x-www, whatever, JSON content type. You could put in a client SSL certificate here. You could ignore unknown SSL certificate authorities. So if you have your privately signed certificates, you could use those here. ignore wrong SSL certificate usage, ignore SSL certificate name mismatches, and so on. So a lot of stuff to ignore things if the SSL certificates are not working properly. You probably don't want to do that, but you could if you're doing testing, that type of thing. But then it just sends out a grant request, and then it brings back an access token, which you would then use for sending your request out to the REST web service. And I just have my own troubleshooting here. I connect up all the different exit paths so I know what happened. There is a Json tool with REST tools to build the JSON. And this is best for a flat structure, not nested values. So if your REST-based web service has a hierarchical set of values you're having to send to it, it won't really work using this JSON builder because this just sends a flat structure. So you have a names list, a values list, and a value type list. So list of strings that gives the names of all the values you want to send, a list of strings of all the values themselves, and then the types for each of those. And the output is going to be this JSON string, which is a string data type.
Can you nest these?
I'm sorry?
Can you nest multiple copies of this to build a nested JSON result?
No. So what I do, let's see if I have my example over here. Here's my assignment for creating the JSON string. So I actually build my own hierarchical string by using new line character, put in presence definition, and I just format it manually in a string myself with new lines and just to make it prettier when it goes through it. Probably don't really need the new line stuff. But you can build the whole string in here in the format that it needs to be. So you go and you find your JSON, you figure out where you're going to have to insert variables, that kind of thing. So you're going to an API, documentation, something like that, and pull in what the JSON needs to be, build it out in its proper string format, which gets to be fine. And then you can just assign that to the same string variable and use it that way. So if it's complex, I just do that. Otherwise, I'll use the JSON builder to build it if it's a flat structure. And just going on from there, switching over to this handler now. I've got the bearer token request, and I send the HTTP request, and this one is going off to PureCloud, so I'm actually giving it the URL, the HTTP method. You can do post, patch, and get. I'm not sure if you can do any others right now. Didn't used to be able to do patch, and I forced it finally to get that going. So, guys, it's our own company. We need this to be able to use it. So, I'm patching something out there. The bearer token is in there. The content type, application JSON. The raw request body is that JSON string. Got my request timeouts, certificates, that kind of stuff. And then it comes back with a response. What is the status code, the text, and then the response headers, the response body. So it'll actually pull back all the JSON from the web service in that response body, presuming it actually works. Once you get the response body, let's see, I'm not parsing the JSON there, I'm actually just pulling stuff out. Actually, I did a patch, I don't need the response, sorry. Go back to the other one. So this one, I'm sending a get, and then based on that get, I'll get a return, hopefully, if I did everything right. And then the JSON parser, I take the response body, which is just a string in JSON, and the output is going to give me a list of the names of the elements, the values associated, and the value type list. And then I can manipulate it from there. Lists of strings, parallel lists, so I can just do parallel list manipulation. That makes sense. So it's actually fairly simple to do, like I said, patches, gets, posts out to a REST-based web service. You just need to know JSON and you're fine. Any questions on the REST tools? I just want to give a quick sample of that because I know some people like to use those. Who would like to use those? Okay. Hurry up. Some quick things on system tools. Talk about DS parameters. Interaction administrator. There's a server parameter section, so I can get a directory services parameter from here. You can put things into these server parameters, then pull them back in handlers. Makes it easier if you want to be able to change values on the fly without having to open up the handler and change something like an on-call phone number or the name of the person who's on call or different things like that. So you just set up as a server parameter, call it from a handler using a get DS parameter, and it works out pretty well. The structured parameters let you build kind of a little table that you can pull from. The nice thing about the structured parameters is that you can actually have a secret value, so it's hashed, nobody can read it. In a handler, it does, and if you're in debug mode, you see that value in plain text, so you can't hide it completely from people. But you can set up these parameters like usernames, passwords, whatever, and have them be secret values that are then pulled into the handlers. So people don't have to know what these things are when they're looking at Interaction Administrator. Just want to point out that as a bonus. A couple of things to point out real quick. System tool unique ID is a handy one to know about when you just want to generate a random 12-digit string identifier. So if you're going to write something to a database, you just need something to be able to query it back real quick. If you're in a handler, you dump something into a database, you don't really know what the order ID is, for example, when you're creating a new order, because SQL is generating that number automatically in the SQL database. You can also dump in a unique string identifier and then query back on that to find out immediately what is the order ID so you can play it back to the customer, let's say. So unique ID is a handy one to be able to get stuff back out of the database or just assign a unique identifier to a handler, put it as an attribute, what have you. I mean, it already has its interaction ID, but sometimes you want to do something a little bit shorter or handier to dump into a database, let's say. So unique ID is a good one to know about. And lookup tool step is a good one to use. Just remember that on the key type, you can go in by key type user extension, whatever, valid use and search. Fairly simple there, but one of the main things you can do is pull back custom values, say from a user or station or line or whatever. So if in my user, I were to go into the custom attributes and add something in there, you can use that lookup to pull back the custom attributes real quick. So that's a handy little tool you have to put some custom stuff onto a user or a work group or whatever and then pull it back quickly. I'm flying through a lot of these, so I'm trying to give you tips and tricks on what you can do rather than, let's build a whole handle here. Accumulators, anybody here use accumulators or have any need for accumulators? Main thing with accumulators, they are designed to store values in the memory so you can access them while handlers are running, and they can do things such as count the number of calls that have come in, do some other things, accumulate values so that you can't otherwise aggregate. You can't count the number of calls in a specific handler without having some central repository that keeps track, because each handler is individual, it doesn't know what's going on in other handlers. Main thing with accumulators, if you're going to use them, you have to go into Interaction Administrator and set them up in several places. So you have to create them first, and then you have to make sure you go into the server configuration and enable these accumulators. I don't have any configured here, but if you create an accumulator in IA and then you don't go here and activate it, it's not going to work in the handler. I always forget this part, then I have to go back there and say, oh yeah, I forgot to turn it on. So that's one thing to remember when you're working with the accumulators themselves. And then you create them down below. You have to create them with a certain type. So there's a data type. You only have the 5 choices, so you're not unlimited in the types of data you can use. And then an instance type could be a fixed list you have to choose from. Could be any instance, so it doesn't matter what you use in the handler. Could be a single instance. And then the deceptive active checkbox here, that has to be checked, and you have to go back to the other section and activate them there as well. Both places. Don't miss that. And then once you've done all the work in Interaction Administrator, you can go back and close and reopen Designer so that then you can work with the accumulator tools to build something. So for example, you want to lock the accumulator that you're going to be working with so that no other handler can modify it while you're working with it. Then you can set it. If it's an integer, then you can unlock it so others can get to it. Then you can access it. It has to be unlocked for you to get the value. You can increment it if it's an integer, or do something else to it if it's a string or boolean or whatever. You don't have to lock it to get it or increment it. Although incrementing, you would probably want to lock it. And use accumulators that way. Usually you build an individual handler to use them. You don't have to. You can just build them into a mainline handler, but usually I'll have that encapsulated in a subroutine. So just something to think about if you want to store values centrally, like counting calls, for example. I once had a radio station was using our product, and they thought it was really cool to be able to use accumulators to count calls coming in for their radio contests. So they, pick the 10th caller or whatever easily without having to pick up the phone every time. Telephony tools, flying through. I know I had too much stuff in this presentation. Okay, here we go. One of the handy things to do in a handler, let's say you've got a call that you want to, let's say you want to have a handler running, and then you want to use a send custom notification to start another handler via a custom notification. So you're not actually using a tool step that fires off an event that runs another handler, like that ACV initiate processing. But you just want to use custom notification and start another handler on the side. But you still want to work with the call that you're dealing with in the first handler. So maybe you're starting a handler on the side that's going to monitor something and then come back, like play music to the call while you're doing a database lookup in the main handler or something of that nature. You need the call ID. Well, you can't just send the call ID across as part of a send custom notification because it can only send strings. So what you'd have to do in the telephony tools is you would convert call ID to string. So it just takes a valid call ID. Now this has to be a valid call ID, meaning the interaction is actually alive on the system. That's pretty easy. This one is picking up the current interaction, let's say, and the output is a string. Then in your send custom notification, send that custom notification to run another handler, and part of that's going to be the custom notification data. So you can put that value for the call ID, the string, into that custom notification data. Then on the other end, in the other handler, that's going to come through as data from that.
What would be the reason for using custom notification instead of just jumping to a use subroutine?
Because we want to run another handler in parallel and let this one continue running on doing its own thing and then run something else on the other side. Or we actually use it a lot in our voice menu type stuff. We actually have a bunch in the remote access menu uses it quite a bit for running different handlers instead of calling subroutines. So yeah, I want to start a whole new instance of something handling this interaction instead of being a subroutine and coming back to this handler. I wanted to start another handler on the side.
What happens when you play string, when you play files or something like that on both handlers? Does it always just take the last one, or?
Sometimes they can play on top of each other.
Oh, okay.
It can be interesting.
Is there something to block the, flush the audio or something like that, to remove
Yeah.
anything that's already playing to?
There is a flush audio tool step to get the flush audio on that particular interaction. Yeah,
But the flush audio just takes everything that's in queue and
that's in
puts
the
it on the
in the
column.
buffer. Yeah, the flush audio flushes everything that's in the buffer on that interaction.
Is there something to empty the buffer?
Empty it? I don't think so. I think it just flushes it and plays it.
Yeah.
I don't think it does empty it so you can get rid of stuff that's assigned
You
in
can't
another
stop
handler.
play.
I don't think so. Not that I know. You can barge in, but you can't stop it. I mean, if the caller could press DTMF to barge in. But yeah.
Oh, okay.
So coming out, there's a notification event, and then there's a custom data list that comes in as part of the initiator. And then you would use that telephony tool to get or convert string to call ID. This tool step fails if the call ID is no longer valid, but you put in a string and it outputs the call ID, and then you can act on that interaction. So that's another handy one that is there when you're wanting to call that other, and you can't just do a subroutine call or don't want to do a subroutine call or not using an event-based initiator coming from one of the tool steps that does that. And I'm going to skip the get set attribute because those are pretty common. I'm going to dive into the custom client button real quick, and then I'm going to come back to a big example. So for client buttons, you can set up a custom client button that will show up in the client and allow the agent to do something by just clicking on it. And one of the things it can do is it can run a handler, so handler notification. So let's say, in my little example here is, we want to call the on-call IT person because they got some kind of issue and I need them to work on whatever. But it's going to automatically go through and place a call to the group of IT people who are on call. It's going to automatically place calls outbound to them until it finds the person that actually answers the call and then connects that call back to the person that clicked the button in their client. So they don't have to actually place a call themselves. They don't have to know the phone number. They don't have to figure out who's on call or whatever, what work group to send it to. It just automatically goes out and tries to track somebody down on their cell phone, which is another hard thing, is if they're on their cell phones, not logged into the client, they can't take ACD calls very easily. So it's just kind of a hunt for trying to find the person that the agent needs to talk to. So we set up a button. It's always available, and it's a handler notification. And with that, let's see that in here. Here's my IT on call, and that's not what I wanted. I wanted the button. So there's a client button press initiator. And in the notification event, so we got button press, and then the object ID, you click and there's a drop-down list of the buttons that are configured on the system. So you want to make sure you select which button you're associating this handler with. You could also just have that left blank and then have a selection step in there that tracks what the name of the button was when it comes into the subroutine, and then have the same subroutine handle multiple buttons if you want to. Either way. But then coming in, it's going to start the processing, and basically I've got it set up structured parameter it goes and pulls from this IT parameter group, and then it's going to pull in the name of the parameter is which number within my list I'm going to be calling. So I've got a list of phone numbers in there, and they're numbered by the person that they're associated with. And basically, set up a loop, IT phone number, add one to it each time, so it goes through the list of phone numbers in the structured parameter. We're going to place a call, so what we're doing is we're actually taking the number from here, the structured parameter, output, dial string, feed it into my dial plan subroutine, so that it will actually format the number properly. It's dialing it from the system, so instead of dialing it from a particular agent's phone, we're going to dial outbound from the system. We're not going to tie up somebody's phone as an agent. The user queue ID is going to be associated, the person who clicked the button is going to be in that call, so we know who the call is on behalf of, and then the dial string that goes outbound. And then we just parse through, we get the attributes, we place this call, so there's an extended place called tool step. It's going to use that dial string that came out of my dial plan subroutine, going to pick the line groups that came out of there. It's already using the station, the system station over here. And basically we're just dialing, performing call analysis because we want to see if we connected to somebody or not. No answer timeout, so we wait how long is it going to answer. If it doesn't answer, then we roll on to the next one. And then the output is going to be interaction 2. So we started with the first interaction, client button press. I'm actually using interaction 2 for this new call that's going outbound. And then we have our results. Is it busy? Is it no answer? Is it not reached? Is there an intercept code or SIT, answering machine, fax, and so on? If there's an error, then we play, hey, sorry, we couldn't place the call, but otherwise we go back and we place the call. If there's a success. Okay, so we called outbound, got a hold of an agent on the IT side on their cell phone. Now we're going to place a call back to that agent, the station queue and the station ID from that button press. So we know which station they were on when they pressed the button. Place a call back to that person, and then we actually transfer the two calls together. So what we're doing is we're placing a call outbound. Once we actually get a live body, we're going to then place a call inbound to the person that clicked the button, and then we're going to transfer those two calls together so that the IT person is talking to the person who clicked the button. It's kind of a fun little thing I did for class, and seems like it actually could be useful sometimes. If they don't reach somebody on that call, it's a busy, no answer, whatever, then we go back through the logging messages that we didn't reach anybody and increment the number that we're working with in the parameters table and go to the next entry in that get parameters table and call the next person who's on call.
That actually sounds like what I've been trying to achieve, but just using the email attendant. Because I've had a lot of complaints that agents you don't get continuous correspondence between a customer and the same agent. So we've been trying to do that just through the attendant. Using the agent's name as the skill, so it will only go to that agent. And so but this would be something similar to that.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. And you can also use those categories to make sure it goes to the right agent. Set a category on that email, and then have that match the agent's name. And look into the help files for the automated category creation, because it does have a flag you can put into the system parameter that will create a category, put an agent into a category with their own name automatically when the system starts, so that it's already built there. You would just assign that agent name basically as a category on an email, and it would go to that.
Okay.
So that's something to look into.
Thank you.
So it just loops around until it finds somebody, and then finally gives up. If the agent doesn't answer the call that comes back to them, it's busy or it fails for some reason, we just disconnect and keep looping around. Play a message to the IT person. Oh, sorry, they didn't answer. So that's an example of using some of these tools together. And unfortunately, that's going to be my last example, putting it all together, because we've run out of time. If you have need for training, go to training.genesis.com. That's our website where we actually have all the listings for the types of classes. We have the administering the CIC system class for admin type stuff, which is good to do if you're going to do handlers. Interaction Center Handler Developer is the one you would take to learn all about the tools, tool steps, everything. And then certification, you get certified as a handler developer. Most of you probably are already. And then there used to be an advanced handlers class. Some of you probably saw it in the books way back. They finally got rid of it because nobody would actually come pay to take it. But it was a fun thing. We played with a lot of stuff. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Like I said, the easy one to remember is askgeorge@genesis.com. And hopefully I can point you in the right direction. All right, thank you very much. That's the end. It'll run away to the next thing.